As a kid, I used to play games like Dungeons and Dragons. I loved fantasy stories. So naturally, I was drawn to the world of J.R.R. Tolkien, which included The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. As an adult, I'm still an avid tabletop gamer, and some of my most played games are fantasy-themed games. These are games where you're the hero that goes into a dungeon or on some story adventure and you level up your character to get powerful enough to kill the beast at the end, as well as all the minions along the way. But one of the things I loved most about these stories was the maps and the artwork that went with them. This was world creation, and you could absolutely just get lost in it. That's not exactly what this lesson is about, but it's close, and it has a direct correlation to what I'm going to show you today. When you're creating content and putting it together for someone else to follow, it stands to reason that you need to provide them some way to find everything. Now, this is usually called navigation. Back in the early days of the web, search engines sent out spiders to crawl the web and validate links. One of the best tools that you could provide them with was a sitemap. It allowed the search engines to follow the map of your site and identify all the important pages. We also would create breadcrumb paths on websites to make sure that people knew where they were on the site. I watched students get lost over and over again in the courses we created. Over the years, I also watched our courses get more complex. After thinking through the challenges that we were experiencing and trying to come up with a solution, I realized there was a simple way to help our students. It should be clear at this point that I tend to lean into the storytelling aspect of course media creation. So naturally, I drew a connection between all of these things. In all the stuff I enjoyed and how the web worked, there was a map. In our courses, there wasn't. Sure, there was a table of contents or a navigation menu down the left, but it wasn't a good content map for the learners. What our course needed was a map of the content so that the learner could see what the course was going to cover, identify the order in which we would present the content, and along the way, show them where they were within the content. This way, at any point, they knew how far along the path they were and how much was left before they were done. It also had the added bonus of re-emphasizing content flow and acted as a tool for somebody that would leave the content and come back to it at a later point. I didn't have a name for this, except for Course Map. But then I saw what they did with the map of Middle-earth in the Lord of the Rings movie series, and I said, I know what to call it. The Map to Mordor. If you ever read The Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings books, think back to that experience. Put yourself back into the story. What was on the first few pages of these books? Do you remember? It's the map of Middle-earth. Naturally, The Hobbit is a shorter, less complex story, so it has a smaller section of the larger map, but these maps are very valuable to the reader. Given how these stories have permeated our modern culture in various ways, I'm going to assume that you have a little familiarity with them. If you're not aware of the story, just hang in there for a few moments and indulge me. If you read the stories, it's important that you have a lay of the land in your head. You need to know where the Shire is, because that's the starting point for both books. You have to know where the Misty Mountains are, since they cut across the path to get to Rohan and to Mirkwood Forest. We know from the story that Gandalf the Wizard wants to go around the mountains, but we don't know how long of a trip that is. The map shows us that. We know that there's a second tower that Saruman is at. Where's that tower in relation to everything else that's happening? We also know that Helm's Deep, which is the focal battle in the two towers, was an important location for the forces of evil and a stronghold for the people of Rohan. But why was it important? Where was it on the map? You have to know these things to understand the strategic value to the forces of evil. What about the Battle of Osgiliath? The city was just outside the lands of Rohan. But how close was it to Mordor, where Sauron was, and all the evil forces? What did it need for that city to get taken? Frodo and Sam, along with Gollum, had to get to Mount Doom, which was in Mordor. How far was their journey to get from Rivendell, the home of the elves, to Mordor? You only really understand that distance when you look at the map of Middle-earth. So hence the name, Map to Mordor. But Barry, that's great and all. I get that you understand what you're talking about, but I just don't get it. I've never seen or read these books. Okay, that's a fair point. Have you ever seen Star Wars? This is epic galactic storytelling. There are planets, locations on planets, trading paths, and all that stuff. How do you know where any of this is without a map of the galaxy or something? What about Game of Thrones? Have you ever watched any episodes of that show? What do they open every episode of the show with? A map. You need to know where the different kingdoms are in relationship to each other for the story to make sense. If either of these don't hit home for you, do you have a story, a movie series, or something that relates? Maybe it's not a physical map. Maybe it's a timeline of events that you have to understand. The point is, these are all tools that help you identify where you are at any point in the process. Don't your students have a similar need when they take your course? You've been experiencing that in this challenge. On day 1, I showed you a large map of what we're going to cover in each of the days. I walked through it with you at a high level so you had an overview of the course and a general overview of the content structure. Then, I zoomed into day 1 and talked about day 1. On day 2, I showed the map again. I zoomed into day 1, talked about what we did on day 1, then moved on to day 2 and focused us on day 2. On day 3, we looked at the map and reviewed day 2. And then we discussed day 3 in more detail. And on day 4, it was similar. And today, on 5, it was a repeat of the concept. The difference today was that I also did a brief review of everything that we'd covered each day. My intention was to make sure that you, the student, was never lost in this course creation world that I've built for you to explore. Are you starting to see how the pieces fit together now? Most course developers don't go this far with their design. Most are happy with an agenda at the beginning and then leaving it there. In an e-learning or a video course, there may be a table of contents available. I'm sure you've seen the stuff that's similar to these examples. Now, these are useful tools, but if the names don't immediately tell you what the content is, it can be difficult to find things later. Also, a high-level overview may not give you a good idea of the length of the content, nor an understanding of how the pieces work together. Revisiting the map throughout the course also allows the student multiple opportunities to connect the dots for themselves. Think about how you use a GPS in a car. Do you just look at it when you start the trip and then as you get to the end? Or do you check it along the way to make sure you're on the right path? Probably the second option. What I'm sharing with you is very similar to the second option. When you just give an agenda at the beginning, it's closer to the first option, but you're really just looking at the map at the beginning. So let's take this a step further and talk about workflows and processes. I've literally seen workbooks with processes in them that have 20 to 30 steps. I've also seen processes that have 10 steps in one application, then the user needs to jump to a second application and perform another 5 to 7 steps, and then they jump back to the first application and perform 2 to 3 more steps. How does the student see this? Do they see it as a continuous process because they're trying to accomplish a single task? How does the trainer present it? Typically, they present it as 3 different processes. Here's an example. The first one is to create some extract file. The second one is to import that extract file into a different application. And then the third is to point the first application at this now available extract file so they can run a report or something like that. The real goal is to run the report. The trainer thinks they're helping the student by breaking it down, but they're really just confusing the matter. When the student comes back to actually do this process for themselves and they go to look in the workbook, chances are they're not going to find a topic that matches what they're looking for, because what they're looking for is how do I run a report? In fact, they're going to find 3 different pieces that together make up that total process, none of which actually answers their immediate question. How do I run a report? What they should do is present it like this. Now, without knowing anything about the process, see if you can answer some basic questions. How many steps are there in the workflow? 3, right? How many steps are there to this entire process? 8, right? How many applications are there? 2, right? The tan application and the blue application. How many times do you visit application A? 2. At the beginning and at the end. Now, if I give you this information, can you visualize it for yourself? So let's try it again. First, we need to create that data extract file. Then we need to import that extract file into a different application. Then the third process is to point the first application at this now available extract file to run a report. Which version was easier for you to follow? And you don't even need to animate this diagram. That's just for the overachievers out there. It makes sense without it. So now that you have this diagram, how do you use it? Well, you start each part of the workflow with it. You discuss the overall process and introduce the overall goal. Then, you focus the viewer where you want them to start. To do this, personally, I like to use semi-transparent boxes, like this. Why semi-transparent? Well, it allows you, the viewer, to see that there's still more to come. You can't really focus on it because I don't want you focusing there. I want you with me in the first stage of the workflow. Here's another point. Imagine I was sharing this information with you over a series of days and you had to remember what we were doing. If I totally hid stages 2 and 3 from you, it might cause you to lose context. Then, when we move to the second part of the workflow, I would do this. Now you're focusing with me on the second stage of the workflow, but you immediately see the progression. How much more do we have left? One stage. Here we are in the last stage. But how do you know it's the last stage? Obviously, there aren't any more stages left. Could I have presented stage 2 like this? Sure, I could do that, but it gives you more information than you need at the moment. If your workflow is long and it has a lot of stages, this can get very overwhelming. Here's another way you can offer support using this tool. Make it available as part of your digital downloads. Then your student can always have it available for them as a reminder. How do they say you should eat an elephant? One bite at a time. But the caveat to that is that you need to know how many bites it'll take, and that you are in fact eating an elephant. But Barry, you might ask me, that's all great, and again, it makes perfect sense. But I'm not teaching someone a software process. I'm sharing a workout routine. I'm sharing a process on how to buy a house with no money down. I'm teaching someone how to create videos for their landing pages. I'm teaching someone how to go about fixing a broken relationship. This list can go on and on. All of these are processes that have various steps and workflows, and some are certainly more complex than others. But they all have processes and steps that you want your student to move through. We've sometimes heard these things called frameworks. There are lots of ways that you could approach this design from a visual point of view. That's up to your creativity and what you can find using a tool like Google or Pinterest to serve you up various examples. I would also recommend searching Google for award-winning websites or best site navigation examples. This will provide you with many ideas as to how you can present your workflows, processes, and overall content maps to your students in a visual manner. This tool will help you create an experience that will help your students move through your content, visualize the structure of your content, and therefore retain more of your content. As with much of what I'm sharing with you in this challenge, most of your students will not recognize the work you're doing to help them not get lost in your content. Your reward will be silence. The reviews that say things like, "The course was easy to navigate," or "I could find all the information easily," that will tell you that your efforts are paying off with this type of tool that you've made available to your students. So your homework for today is to look at your course and see if you could come up with a course map that makes sense and that you can share with your students so they can follow along with you as you reveal your content to them as they move through your course.